Thomas Givens was the kind of teacher everyone admired, not just for his sharp intellect, but for the way he brought literature to life in the classroom. He had the unique ability to make every student feel seen, as if their thoughts and opinions mattered. That was part of the reason students flocked to his office after hours, seeking advice about their essays or simply talking about books. But there was one student who lingered longer than most, whose presence stirred something in Thomas that he tried hard to ignore. Andrew Harris. A senior, bright and reserved, he sat in the back of the room during class, his expression always one of deep contemplation. His essays were consistently the most thoughtful, with layers of analysis that surpassed his peers. At first, it was purely professional. Thomas was impressed by Andrew's work and started offering more feedback, taking an interest in his academic progress. It was the kind of mentorship teachers were supposed to give, nothing unusual. But something about Andrew felt different. In just a few days, their conversation started to lengthen, moving beyond simple academic topics. What began as innocent discussions about books and future plans soon carried an undeniable tension, an unspoken but palpable energy between them. As they spent more time together, the boundaries of their relationship shifted. The moments after class became longer and more personal, and slowly what had once been mentorship evolved into something more. Without fully realizing it, they had crossed a line, one that marked the beginning of their affair. One day, after one of their usual discussions, Andrew hesitated at the door. He turned back to Thomas, his eyes filled with a question he hadn't asked yet. "Mr. Givens," Andrew began slowly, "do you ever feel like you're stuck? Like, no matter how much you try to figure things out, life keeps pulling you in a direction you didn't choose?" Thomas wasn't sure how to answer at first. The question caught him off guard, coming from a 17-year-old. He leaned back in his chair, considering his response. "Yeah, sometimes," he admitted, his voice softer now. "I think everyone feels that way at some point." Andrew nodded, but didn't leave. "I don't know. It just feels like everyone has these expectations. You know? Parents, teachers, friends, they all want you to be something. And sometimes, I'm not sure who I really am." There it was again. That pull, that subtle connection between them that went beyond teacher and student. Thomas knew he should say something to distance himself, to remind Andrew of the professional boundary between them. But instead, he found himself wanting to be there for him, wanting to understand him in a way no one else seemed to. "You don't have to figure it all out right now," Thomas said gently. "You're still young. You have time." Andrew's eyes lingered on him, and for a moment, the room seemed smaller, more intimate. "Thanks," Andrew whispered, a hint of something more behind his words. "It means a lot, hearing that from you." That was how it began, a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the way they interacted. Their conversations grew longer, stretching beyond school hours, sometimes into the early evening. What had started as academic discussions morphed into something else, something more personal, more complicated. The boundary between them blurred, but neither of them acknowledged it. Not yet. Then came the text messages. It started with a simple question about an assignment one evening. "Hey, Mr. Givens, quick question about tomorrow's reading. Is there something specific you want us to focus on?" Thomas read the message, his thumb hovering over the reply button. He had given his number to a few students for academic purposes, nothing more. This was no different, he told himself. He typed a brief response and thought that would be the end of it, but it wasn't. A few nights later, another message came. This one was less about class and more personal. "Have you read Catcher in the Rye? I feel like it says a lot about feeling lost." Thomas hesitated, unsure if responding to a text like this was appropriate. But something about Andrew's words drew him in, and before he knew it, he was typing back. "Yeah, it's one of my favorites." Holden's struggle to find meaning resonates with a lot of people. The conversation flowed easily from there, moving from books to life. Andrew asked about Thomas's own experiences in college, what it was like to grow up, and whether he ever felt the same sense of disillusionment Holden did. Thomas found himself sharing more than he usually would with a student. But Andrew was different. He wasn't just any student. He was thoughtful, sensitive, someone Thomas felt connected to in a way he couldn't explain. As their texts continued, Thomas knew he was walking a fine line. He told himself it was harmless, that they were just talking about literature. But deep down, he knew it was becoming something more. Each message felt like a step toward something inevitable, something he couldn't quite name but couldn't stop either. Then came the moment that changed everything. It was a Friday afternoon, and the school was emptying out for the weekend. Andrew had stayed behind as usual to go over an essay, but this time the air felt different, charged with an energy that neither of them acknowledged. They talked as they always did, their conversation flowing naturally, but underneath the words was an unspoken tension. As Andrew gathered his things to leave, he paused by the door, turning back to Thomas with a look that was both hesitant and determined. "Can I ask you something personal?" Thomas felt his heart quicken, but he nodded. "Of course. Do you ever feel like you don't belong?" Andrew's voice was soft, almost a whisper. "Like, no matter how hard you try to fit into the mold people expect, it's never really you?" Thomas swallowed hard, the weight of the question settling between them. He could see the vulnerability in Andrew's eyes, the need for connection, for understanding. And in that moment, Thomas knew they were standing on the edge of something dangerous. "Yes," Thomas replied, his voice barely audible. "I've felt that way before." Andrew stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. For a moment, neither of them moved. The tension was thick, almost suffocating, and Thomas knew he should stop it. Say something, do something to pull them back to where they belonged. But he didn't. Instead, he stood frozen, caught in the pull of whatever was happening between them. Andrew reached out, his hand brushing lightly against Thomas's arm, and that was all it took. In an instant, the line between them shattered. Thomas leaned in, closing the distance between them, and before either of them could think, their lips met in a brief, hesitant kiss. It was over as quickly as it had begun, but the damage was done. They pulled apart, both breathing heavily, the reality of what had just happened sinking in. "We can't," Thomas started, but Andrew shook his head. "I know," Andrew whispered, his eyes filled with something Thomas couldn't quite name. "But I don't want to stop." Neither did Thomas. After that kiss, everything changed. What had begun as subtle glances, fleeting touches, and meaningful conversations had now evolved into something real, something dangerous. He tried to convince himself that it was a one-time thing, that they could go back to being simply teacher and student. But deep down, he knew that was impossible. The kiss had opened a door that couldn't be shut, and the temptation that lay on the other side was too powerful to ignore. For a few days, they kept their distance. Andrew didn't stay after class like he used to, and Thomas found himself anxiously watching the door, waiting for him to walk through it. But Andrew didn't come, and the silence between them was deafening. Thomas told himself it was for the best, that it was better to let things cool down before anything more happened. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, that without Andrew's presence, his days felt hollow. Then on a rainy Thursday afternoon, Andrew appeared at his classroom door again. He stood there, drenched from the downpour outside, but his expression was calm, resolute. Thomas's heart raced as he gestured for him to come in, closing the door behind him. "We need to talk," Andrew said softly, his voice barely audible over the sound of the rain tapping against the windows. Thomas nodded, sitting behind his desk, trying to maintain some semblance of professionalism. "I agree. What happened?" Andrew cut him off, stepping closer. "I don't regret it." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Thomas felt a rush of emotions, fear, guilt, desire. He wanted to tell Andrew that it was a mistake, that they couldn't continue this. But when he looked into Andrew's eyes, he saw something familiar. The same loneliness, the same need for connection that had drawn them together in the first place. "I don't either," Thomas admitted, his voice low. Andrew's shoulders relaxed slightly, and for the first time in days, the tension between them eased. They stood in silence for a moment, the only sound the steady rhythm of the rain. Thomas knew he should end it right then and there, draw the boundary they had so carelessly crossed. But instead, he reached out, taking Andrew's hand in his. "What do we do now?" Andrew asked, his voice soft but filled with uncertainty. Thomas hesitated. He didn't have an answer. How could he? There was no clear path forward. Their relationship, whatever it had become, existed in a gray area, one that was fraught with danger and uncertainty. But at that moment, with Andrew standing so close, none of that seemed to matter. All that mattered was the way they made each other feel, the connection they shared. "We keep it between us," Thomas said finally. "No one else needs to know." Andrew nodded, relief washing over his face. "I can do that." From that day on, their affair continued in secret. They met after school in Thomas's classroom, always careful to avoid being seen. On the weekends, they would steal moments together in quiet, hidden places, the park at dusk, an out-of-the-way cafe, and sometimes even at Thomas's apartment when he was sure no one would notice. It was thrilling and dangerous, and for a while that was enough to keep them going. But as the weeks passed, the pressure of their secret began to weigh on them both. Thomas became more paranoid, constantly looking over his shoulder, fearing that someone might catch on. The whispers in the hallways that he used to ignore now seemed louder, more threatening. Every time a student glanced in his direction, he wondered if they knew. And then there was Andrew. While he remained calm on the surface, Thomas could sense the strain it was taking on him as well. One evening, as they lay together on Thomas's couch, Andrew turned to him with a serious expression. "How long can we keep doing this?" Thomas looked at him, unsure how to respond. He had been asking himself the same question for weeks. How long could they keep sneaking around, lying to everyone around them? But the thought of ending things, of going back to a life without Andrew, felt unbearable. "I don't know," Thomas admitted, "but I don't want to stop." Andrew sighed, his fingers tracing absent patterns on Thomas's arm. "Me neither. But it's getting harder. I don't want to hide anymore." Thomas felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He knew this day would come eventually, that their relationship couldn't stay a secret forever. But the idea of coming clean, of facing the consequences of what they had done, filled him with dread. "If anyone finds out—" "No one's going to find out," Andrew interrupted, his voice firm. "We've been careful. We can keep being careful." But Thomas wasn't so sure. The pressure was building, and he could feel the walls closing in. Something was going to give. He just didn't know when or how. Then the first real crack in their secret appeared. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon, and Thomas was at his desk, grading papers, when his phone buzzed with a text. It was from Andrew. "We need to talk. Meet me after class." Thomas's heart raced as he read the message. Andrew had never been so direct before, and the urgency in his words set off alarm bells in Thomas's mind. What had happened? Had someone found out? He spent the rest of the day in a haze, his mind spinning with worst-case scenarios. After the final bell rang, Thomas waited in his classroom, his nerves on edge. When Andrew finally arrived, he looked anxious, pacing back and forth as soon as he stepped inside. "What's going on?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with concern. Andrew stopped pacing and looked at him, his expression tense. "Someone knows." The words hit Thomas like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean, someone knows?" Andrew pulled out his phone and handed it to Thomas. On the screen was a message from an unknown number. "I know what's going on between you and Mr. Givens. If you don't want this to get out, you'll do exactly what I say." Thomas's blood ran cold. Someone had discovered their secret, and now they were being blackmailed. "Who sent this?" Thomas asked, his voice shaking. "I don't know," Andrew replied, his face pale. "It came out of nowhere. I haven't told anyone, I swear." Thomas sank into his chair, his mind racing. How had this happened? They had been so careful, so discreet. But someone had seen something or maybe overheard a conversation. Either way, their secret was no longer safe. "What are we going to do?" Andrew asked, his voice trembling with fear. Thomas didn't have an answer. The walls were closing in faster than he had anticipated, and now their affair was at the mercy of someone else. Someone who could ruin them both with a single word. "We need to figure out who this is," Thomas said finally, his voice steadier than he felt. "And we need to make sure they stay quiet." Andrew nodded, though he looked far from reassured. "How?" "I don't know yet," Thomas admitted. "But we'll figure it out. Together." But the truth was, Thomas didn't know if they could. The weight of their secret was becoming too much to bear, and now that someone else knew, the danger was real. Every decision from this point on would have consequences, and one wrong move could destroy them both. The days that followed were a blur of anxiety and paranoia. Thomas and Andrew tried to figure out who could be behind the messages, but they came up with nothing. The texts continued, each one more threatening than the last, but no demands were made. It was as if the sender was toying with them, letting them sweat it out, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then one night everything came crashing down. Thomas was at home going over the latest batch of texts from the unknown sender when there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Andrew standing there, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "What is it?" Thomas asked, immediately on edge. Andrew held up his phone, his hands shaking. "They sent me something new. I think they want to meet." Thomas's stomach dropped as he read the message. It was an address, along with a simple instruction. "Come alone." "We can't go," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's a trap." "I know," Andrew whispered, his voice shaking. "But what choice do we have?" Thomas stared at the screen, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this knew their secret, and now they were demanding a meeting. But why? What did they want? "I'm going with you," Thomas said firmly. "No," Andrew replied, shaking his head. "If we both go, it'll look suspicious. I'll go alone." Thomas wanted to argue, but deep down he knew Andrew was right. This was dangerous, but they had no choice. The tension between them was unbearable as Andrew turned to leave, and Thomas's heart raced with fear and guilt. Something about this felt wrong, very wrong. The moment Andrew left the apartment, the tension between him and Thomas had become unbearable. It wasn't just the looming threat of their secret being exposed. It was the sense that something more dangerous was about to unfold. Thomas felt it in his bones, a sinking feeling that told him things had gone too far, and they were about to lose control. The messages had been relentless over the past few days. It started with vague warnings, threats from an anonymous number, but they had escalated. Whoever was behind them knew more than they should. Someone close to them had pieced together the truth. Andrew had tried to downplay it at first, convincing Thomas that it was just a prank or a jealous classmate who suspected something. But now, it was clear that this was no joke. As Thomas sat in his apartment waiting for Andrew to respond to the latest cryptic message, his phone buzzed again. He reached for it quickly, half expecting another threat. But it was from Andrew. "I'm heading to the cabin. Meet me there." Thomas's heart sank. The cabin, Andrew's family's old summer house hours away from town. Whoever was behind this knew about the cabin, knew that it was a private place, a place where secrets could be kept. This wasn't a random person. This was someone who knew Andrew's life intimately. Someone close. Thomas immediately grabbed his jacket and keys, heading out the door without a second thought. He drove fast, the roads winding through the dark woods as rain battered against the windshield. The feeling of dread sat heavy in his chest, growing with each passing mile. He knew something terrible was waiting for them at the cabin, but there was no turning back now. By the time he arrived, the sky was pitch black, and the rain had turned into a steady drizzle. The cabin loomed in the distance, its old, worn-down structure barely visible in the dark. Thomas could see Andrew's car parked nearby, and his heart raced as he approached the front door. Inside, the cabin was silent. Thomas stepped through the doorway, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The air smelled of dust and damp wood, the remnants of a once-loved summer getaway now forgotten. He could hear the faint sound of movement coming from the living room and followed it, his pulse quickening with every step. When he entered the room, he saw Andrew standing by the fireplace, his back turned to the door. Across from him, standing in the shadows, was a figure Thomas recognized immediately: Mark. Mark had always been a constant presence in Andrew's life. His best friend, the quiet and steady one who seemed to know Andrew better than anyone. But now, in the dim light of the cabin, there was something off about Mark. He wasn't just standing there to confront Andrew like a betrayed friend. His eyes flicked between Andrew and Thomas, filled with an intensity that made Thomas's heart pound. "Mark?" Thomas's voice wavered with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Mark didn't answer immediately. He stepped forward into the light, revealing a twisted expression of anger and something darker: pain, jealousy, and longing. His gaze locked on Thomas, and the look sent a chill down Thomas's spine. "I've been waiting for this," Mark said quietly, his voice laced with bitterness. "Waiting for you to finally see me." Thomas frowned, confused. "What are you talking about? This isn't about you." Mark laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Not about me? It's always been about me, Thomas. I've been watching all this time, watching you two together. You think I didn't know? You think I didn't see what was going on between you and Andrew?" Thomas glanced at Andrew, who looked equally confused and alarmed. "Mark, we can explain," Andrew began, but Mark cut him off, his eyes now flashing with raw emotion. "I don't need your explanations, Andrew," Mark spat, his voice trembling with anger. "I've heard enough lies from both of you. You never noticed, did you? You never saw me. Either of you." Thomas took a step forward, his pulse quickening as he realized where this was going. "Mark, whatever you think you saw, I didn't think I saw it, Thomas. I know what I saw," Mark said, his voice cracking. His eyes moved from Andrew to Thomas again, and suddenly the pieces began to fall into place for Thomas. This wasn't just about Andrew. This was about him too. Mark's voice lowered, and the vulnerability beneath his anger became clear. "I loved you, Thomas. I always have. From the moment I first saw you, I knew you were different. I watched you, admired you, wanted to be close to you." His voice caught as he glanced at Andrew with a mixture of betrayal and bitterness. "But you never saw me, did you? You only saw him." Thomas froze, his heart racing as the weight of Mark's confession hit him. Mark wasn't just angry because Andrew had hidden the affair. He was furious because he had feelings for Thomas too, feelings he had been holding on to in secret for God knows how long. "Mark," Thomas began cautiously, "I didn't know. I had no idea you felt this way." "Of course you didn't," Mark snapped, his voice rising again. "You never bothered to look. You were too busy with him, too busy sneaking around behind my back, thinking you could get away with it." Andrew took a step forward, his voice shaking. "Mark, you're my best friend. You know I didn't mean to hurt you." Mark's expression darkened, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "But you did, Andrew. You took everything from me. You took him away from me." Andrew paled, realizing now the full extent of Mark's jealousy. "This isn't what you think," Andrew said quietly. "You're still my best friend. This doesn't change that." But Mark shook his head, his face contorted with rage and despair. "You don't get it, Andrew. You never did. You had everything. You had him. And you knew how I felt, but you didn't care. You let me think we were still friends while you betrayed me." Andrew looked at Thomas, desperate to defuse the situation. "Mark, we can figure this out. We don't have to do this." But Mark wasn't listening anymore. The jealousy, the pain, the years of hidden feelings were too much. His hands trembled as he reached into his jacket, pulling out a knife, the blade catching the flicker of the fireplace. Thomas's blood ran cold. "Mark, put the knife down. We can talk about this." Mark's eyes gleamed with cold determination. "Talk? Now you want to talk?" "It's too late for that, Thomas. You had your chance." Before either Thomas or Andrew could react, Mark lunged forward with the knife, aiming straight for Andrew. The motion was quick, too quick for Thomas to stop. The blade plunged into Andrew's side, and the sickening sound of metal meeting flesh filled the cabin. Andrew gasped, stumbling backward, his hands flying to his side where the knife had struck. Blood seeped between his fingers, his face twisted in shock and pain. "Andrew!" Thomas shouted, rushing forward to catch him as he collapsed to the floor. He knelt beside Andrew, his hands frantically pressing against the wound to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, Andrew. You're going to be okay." But Andrew's breaths were coming in shallow gasps, his eyes wide with fear and pain. He looked up at Thomas, his voice weak and trembling. "Thomas." Thomas's heart shattered as he held Andrew, feeling the life slipping away from him. The blood poured too quickly, the wound too deep. At that moment, Thomas knew that there was nothing he could do. Mark stood over them, his face pale, but his expression filled with grim satisfaction. "You never should have come between us," he said quietly, his voice shaking with emotion. "You never should have taken him from me." Thomas looked up at Mark, fury blazing in his eyes. "You killed him. You killed your best friend." Mark's face twisted with a mixture of regret and defiance. "I didn't want to. But you made me. You and him. You made me do this." Thomas's hands were covered in Andrew's blood as he cradled his lifeless body, the weight of the moment crashing down on him like a tidal wave. His chest heaved with sobs as he looked down at Andrew, the boy he had risked everything for, now gone. Mark took a step back, the knife falling from his hand and clattering to the floor. His eyes were still wild, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in them now. He stared at Andrew's body, as if only now realizing the full impact of what he had done. "I loved you," Mark whispered, his voice barely audible. "Both of you. But you didn't love me back." Without another word, Mark turned and walked out of the cabin, leaving Thomas alone in the suffocating silence. The only sound that remained was the crackling of the dying fire and the steady patter of rain against the windows. Thomas remained at the scene, cradling Andrew's lifeless body, his expression vacant, overwhelmed by a grief so profound it seemed to consume him entirely. The events of that night had spiraled far beyond his control, a nightmare he never could have anticipated. In the end, it wasn't just their secret affair that was shattered, but the lives of everyone involved. Mark's hidden jealousy, driven by long-suppressed feelings, had detonated with lethal force, unraveling everything in a single, devastating moment. What was left in the wake of this tragedy was a landscape of irreversible damage, betrayal, murder, and the haunting realization that for all three of them, the future they once envisioned had been violently torn apart. The bond between friends, lovers, and confidants had been destroyed, leaving behind a grim reality that could never be undone.